For 12 years, Vivian Ashcroft had not spoken a single word. The billionaire founder of Ashcroft Textiles had survived a car accident that left her doctors baffled, her mind by every measurable test fully intact. Her voice simply gone, vanished behind a silence that 17 different specialists across 3 countries had failed to explain or undo. Her family had spent a fortune on treatment. Her company had been run for over a decade by a board of directors and a nephew who circled her wealth like it was already his. Then, one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, a single dad named Walter Higgins, delivering a package to her estate because the regular driver had called in sick, said one sentence to her by accident. An unscripted, unremarkable sentence meant for no one but himself, and Vivian Ashcroft spoke for the first time in 12 years. If you love stories about the quiet, ordinary people who see what the experts miss, press subscribe now, because you're not going to believe how this story ends. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Vivian Ashcroft had built Ashcroft Textiles from a single struggling mill in North Carolina into one of the largest specialty fabric manufacturers in the country. A company whose materials found their way into everything from military uniforms to high-end furniture upholstery. A business empire she had built over 4 decades with a combination of relentless work ethic and an almost uncanny instinct for exactly which markets were about to matter. She was, by the time of her accident at age 61, one of the wealthiest women in the state of North Carolina, a widow with no children of her own. Her closest living relative and nephew, named Preston Ashcroft, who had spent most of his adult life on the periphery of the family business, never quite trusted with real authority, never quite willing to build anything of his own either. The accident happened on a rain-slick highway outside Charlotte on a November evening, when a delivery truck lost control on a curve and struck Vivian's car nearly head-on. She survived, against what her trauma surgeon later admitted were fairly grim initial odds. But the impact left her with a traumatic brain injury that, in the weeks following the crash, produced a symptom no one on her medical team had ever personally encountered in exactly this form: complete, total loss of speech, despite full cognitive function, normal comprehension, and no damage to the physical structures of her throat, vocal cords, or mouth that any imaging technology could detect. The medical term her doctors eventually settled on, after months of testing and disagreement among specialists, was a rare and poorly understood condition sometimes called psychogenic or functional mutism following traumatic brain injury, a diagnosis that essentially meant her doctors could observe the symptom without being able to fully explain its mechanism or reliably predict its resolution. Vivian could hear. She could read. She could write laboriously with her right hand, which had also been partially affected by the accident, and she could understand every word spoken to her with complete clarity. She simply could not, for reasons that 17 specialists across the United States, England, and Switzerland would spend the next 12 years failing to fully explain, produce speech. The 12 years that followed Vivian's accident were, by every account of the small household staff who remained loyal to her throughout, a slow, grinding erosion of a life that had once been defined by her voice, her sharp instructions to executives, her famous ability to close a difficult negotiation with a single perfectly chosen sentence. She communicated instead through a combination of handwriting, an early tablet-based communication device her physical therapist introduced in the 3rd year, and increasingly as the years passed, a growing withdrawal from the world that her longtime housekeeper, a woman named Dolores Ferris who had worked for the Ashcroft family for over 20 years, watched with quiet, helpless grief. Ashcroft Textiles continued to operate under the direction of a board of directors Vivian herself had appointed years before the accident, with her nephew Preston gradually accumulating more influence over the years, first as a board observer, then as a voting member, then, 6 years after the accident, as the company's chief operating officer, a position he had lobbied for aggressively and had been granted, over the quiet objections of several longtime board members, largely because Vivian's own inability to communicate left the board without a clear, forceful voice to push back against his ambitions. Preston was, by the account of nearly everyone who worked closely with him, not a cruel man exactly, but an impatient one, someone who had spent years watching his aunt build something extraordinary while he remained, in his own mind, permanently relegated to the margins of it, and who had come, in the years following her accident, to view her silence less as a tragedy to be endured and more as an opportunity finally, quietly, arriving. He never said this explicitly to anyone, and would have denied it fiercely if asked, but Dolores Ferris, who watched him visit Vivian with increasing frequency in the 2 years before this story truly begins, always carrying legal documents, she suspected Vivian could not fully evaluate given her communication limitations, had her own quiet suspicions about exactly what Preston was working toward. Vivian herself, isolated in the large family estate on the outskirts of Charlotte, spent those 12 years in a kind of half-life that no amount of medical treatment had been able to fully address. She read constantly, devouring books at a pace that suggested her mind remained every bit as sharp as it had been before the accident. She wrote, in a careful, deliberate hand that had grown steadier over the years despite her right hand's lingering weakness, letters to old friends who visited less and less often as the years wore on, uncertain how to sustain a relationship with someone who could not answer them in the way conversations require. She watched, through board meeting minutes Dolores brought her, and through her own careful reading of company reports, as Preston's influence over her life's work slowly grew, and she found herself, more often than she would ever have admitted aloud, even if she still could, wondering whether she would spend the remainder of her life a silent, wealthy prisoner inside a house and a company that no longer entirely felt like her own. Walter Higgins had been driving delivery routes for a regional courier company for 6 years, ever since a knee injury had ended his career as a warehouse supervisor and left him needing work that kept him moving rather than standing in one place for 8 hours at a stretch. He was 52 years old, a widower raising his 16-year-old granddaughter, Chloe, after his own daughter, Chloe's mother, had died of an overdose 4 years earlier, a loss that had reshaped Walter's entire understanding of what the remainder of his life was supposed to look like. Walter had never planned to raise a teenager alone at 52. He had planned, in the vague, unexamined way most people plan their later years, on a quiet retirement eventually, perhaps some fishing, perhaps a smaller house somewhere warmer than the Carolina winters. Instead, he found himself navigating high school parent-teacher conferences and curfews and the particular, exhausting vigilance required to raise a grieving teenager who had lost her mother to the same disease Walter had watched slowly take his daughter over the better part of a decade. He did it without complaint, mostly, and without much help, and he had come, in the 4 years since Chloe came to live with him, to understand himself as exactly the kind of man his own late wife would have expected him to become when the moment demanded it. He was not, on the Tuesday afternoon this story turns on, supposed to be delivering to the Ashcroft estate at all. The regular route driver, a younger man named Deshaun who normally handled the wealthier addresses on the outskirts of Charlotte, had called in sick that morning with the flu, and Walter, having worked nearly every route in the region at some point over 6 years, had been asked to cover the remaining stops on Deshaun's list, the Ashcroft estate among them. Walter knew, in the vague way most delivery drivers know things about their wealthiest customers, that the Ashcroft address belonged to someone important, a business, a fortune, a name that occasionally appeared in the local paper's business section. He did not know, when he pulled his van up the long gravel drive that afternoon, anything about the specifics of Vivian Ashcroft's condition, her 12 years of silence, or the quiet, slow-motion crisis unfolding inside the walls of her house. Dolores Ferris answered the door, as she usually did for deliveries, and Walter carried the package, a modest box containing replacement parts for an antique record player Vivian had owned since her 20s, up the front steps and through the entryway at Dolores's direction, since the box required a signature from a resident rather than simply being left at the door. Dolores led him toward a sitting room at the back of the house, where Vivian, seated in a wingback chair near a large window overlooking the estate's gardens, spent most of her afternoons. Walter had no particular expectations walking into that room. He had made thousands of deliveries over 6 years, to homes far grander and far humbler than this one, and he approached the elderly woman in the chair with the same easy, unhurried friendliness he brought to every stop on his route. a habit born less of any particular training and more of Walter's own genuine, uncomplicated belief that everyone he met deserved a moment of ordinary human kindness, regardless of the size of their house. He set the box down on a side table near Vivian's chair and asked, out of simple habit rather than any expectation of an answer, whether she needed him to open it for her. Dolores, standing just behind him, began quietly explaining that Mrs. Ashcroft was unable to respond verbally, that a nod or a gesture would suffice, but Walter, absorbed in the small, familiar task of unpacking a box of fragile antique parts, had already begun talking, the way he often did on deliveries, filling the quiet with easy, unremarkable conversation that required no response. A habit that had made him a favorite among the elderly customers on his regular routes who sometimes went entire days without another human voice in their homes. He mentioned, unprompted and entirely by accident, that his own late wife had owned a record player almost exactly like the antique sitting in the corner of Vivian's sitting room, a detail he noticed while setting down the box, and he said, without thinking, in the same easy tone he might have used with any stranger, that she used to play one particular song every single Sunday morning while she made breakfast, a song Walter named without a second thought, a song called Sunday Kind of Love, an old jazz standard his late wife had loved beyond all reasonable proportion, and that he still, for years after her death, could not hear without a lump rising in his throat. He said, finishing the thought as he lifted the record player's replacement needle carefully out of its packaging, that he supposed some songs just find their way into a person and never fully leave, no matter how many years pass. It was at this point, according to Dolores Ferris's own account, given later and repeated many times in the months that followed, that Vivian Ashcroft, silent for 12 years, made a sound none of them had heard from her since before the accident. It was not at first a word. It was closer to a gasp, a sharp intake of breath that made Dolores turn instantly from the doorway, and then, haltingly, in a voice rough and unpracticed from over a decade of disuse, Vivian Ashcroft said a single word. She said Thomas. Thomas, as Dolores would later learn from Vivian herself, in the halting, overwhelming days of recovered speech that followed, had been Vivian's husband, dead for nearly 20 years by the time of her accident, a man whose memory Vivian had carried through every year of her silence without ever once, until that afternoon, being able to say his name aloud. Thomas Ashcroft had loved that same song, Sunday Kind of Love, had played it on that very record player every Sunday morning of their 31-year marriage, a ritual so deeply woven into the fabric of Vivian's memory that Walter Higgins' offhand, accidental mention of it had done something no specialist, no therapist, no carefully designed treatment protocol had managed to do in 12 years. It had reached, directly and without any deliberate intention on Walter's part, the exact emotional and neurological pathway that had been holding her voice hostage since the accident. The doctors who examined Vivian in the weeks that followed, astonished and more than a little humbled by what had happened, offered an explanation that was, in the end, both scientifically grounded and almost unbearably human. Functional mutism following traumatic brain injury, several of the specialists explained in follow-up consultations, often involves not a physical inability to produce speech, but a kind of psychological and neurological blockage, frequently connected, in ways researchers still do not fully understand, to unresolved grief or trauma that becomes entangled with the injury itself. Vivian's doctors theorized that some part of her mind, in the aftermath of an accident that had nearly ended her life, had connected her voice, quite literally, to the memory of the husband whose death she had never fully allowed herself to grieve aloud, a grief she had carried silently for nearly 2 decades before the accident and had then, in some deep and inexplicable way, fused with her ability to speak at all. Walter Higgins, standing in that sitting room with a record player needle still in his hand, had said nothing designed to unlock any of this. He had simply told the truth about his own grief, in his own unguarded way, at the exact moment and in the exact emotional register that Vivian's mind, for reasons no specialist could have engineered or predicted, was finally ready to hear it. Vivian's recovery of speech was not instantaneous or complete in the way a dramatic retelling might suggest. Her first weeks of renewed speech were halting, exhausting, and often limited to short phrases, the physical and neurological pathways for producing sustained speech requiring genuine relearning even once the underlying block had somehow released. But within 4 months, working with a speech therapist who described Vivian's case as the single most remarkable recovery of her 20-year career, Vivian Ashcroft was speaking in full, if sometimes labored, sentences, and within 7 months, she was speaking with something approaching the sharp, decisive clarity that had once made her boardroom presence legendary. She asked, almost immediately upon regaining reliable speech, to see the complete financial and legal records of Ashcroft Textiles, records she had been unable to fully evaluate during her years of silence. When Preston had grown accustomed to bringing her documents, she could acknowledge only through nods and simple written responses that never quite captured the full weight of what she was being asked to approve. What she found, over the following weeks of careful review, alongside a forensic account, she personally hired an company attorney whose loyalty predated Preston's rise entirely, was a pattern of decisions that, examined individually, might have passed as merely aggressive business judgment, but that, examined together across 6 years of Preston's growing authority, told a far more troubling story. Preston had, over those 6 years, steadily shifted company assets into a series of subsidiary entities in which he held significant personal ownership stakes, structured in ways complex enough to have avoided triggering any single dramatic red flag, but that in aggregate amounted to a slow, deliberate transfer of value away from Ashcroft Textiles and toward Preston's own personal holdings. A transfer that had accelerated notably in the 18 months before Vivian's speech returned, though some part of Preston had begun to sense that his aunt's silence and his own unchecked authority might not last forever. Vivian Ashcroft's return to active leadership of the company she had built was, by every account of the employees who witnessed it, one of the more remarkable moments in the company's 4-decade history. She called an emergency board meeting 6 weeks after her speech had recovered sufficiently for sustained conversation. Walking into a boardroom she had not physically entered in over a decade, and delivered, in a voice still occasionally rough around its edges but unmistakably her own, a detailed, methodical presentation of exactly what her forensic accountant had found in Preston's 6 years of stewardship. Preston, present in the room and visibly unprepared for the specificity of what his aunt had uncovered, attempted initially to characterize the asset transfers as standard business restructuring, a defense that collapsed within minutes under Vivian's own detailed, document-by-document rebuttal, delivered with the same precision that had once made her legendary in negotiations decades earlier. The board, several of whose longtime members had harbored their own quiet doubts about Preston's leadership for years without the standing or the information to act on them, voted unanimously, within that same meeting, to remove Preston from his position as Chief Operating Officer and to reinstate Vivian as Active Chief Executive Officer, a title she had technically retained throughout her silence, but had been unable, for 12 years, to meaningfully exercise. The subsequent legal proceedings, pursued through civil litigation rather than criminal charges after Preston agreed to a settlement that returned the substantial majority of the diverted assets to the company, concluded within a year, and Preston Ashcroft, his reputation within the North Carolina business community substantially and permanently damaged, relocated out of state not long afterward, a quiet, unremarkable exit from a story he had once, in the years of his aunt's silence, believed, was building steadily toward an entirely different ending. Vivian did not forget the man who had, entirely by accident, given her back her voice. Within weeks of her recovery, she asked Dolores to help her track down the delivery driver who had visited that Tuesday afternoon, a task that led, through the regional courier company's dispatch records, directly to Walter Higgins. Walter, when Dolores first called him, assumed initially that some mistake had been made, or worse, that a complaint had been filed about his delivery, and he was, by his own later admission, genuinely bewildered when Dolores explained instead that Mrs. Ashcroft wished to see him, in person, to thank him for something he did not fully understand he had done. He drove out to the estate on his day off, uncertain what to expect, and found Vivian Ashcroft waiting for him in the same sitting room, seated in the same wingback chair, the antique record player now fully restored and sitting nearby. She told him, in her own still recovering voice, the full story of what had happened that afternoon, of Thomas and their 31 years together, and the song he had played every Sunday morning of their marriage, and of the 12 years of silence that had finally, inexplicably, broken open at the sound of a stranger's unguarded grief matching her own so precisely that some locked door inside her mind had simply, quietly, opened. Walter listened to all of it with the same easy, patient attention he brought to every conversation, and when she finished he told her, honestly, that he had said what he said that day not because he understood anything about her condition or her grief, but simply because it was true, and because he had learned, in the years since his own wife's death and his daughter's, that saying true things out loud, even to strangers, even when no one asked, was sometimes the only thing that made grief bearable at all. Vivian Ashcroft, in the months that followed, established a personal foundation, funded initially from her own resources rather than the company's, dedicated to research into functional neurological disorders following traumatic brain injury, a field she had discovered, in her 12 years of searching for answers, remained chronically underfunded and poorly understood relative to the number of people it quietly devastated. She named Walter Higgins to the Foundation's advisory board, not for any medical expertise he did not claim to possess, but because she told the assembled founding members of the Foundation's first meeting at least one voice in the room who understood that healing sometimes arrives not through carefully engineered treatment, but through the simple, unguarded honesty of an ordinary person telling the truth about their own grief to another person who happened to need, more than anything else in the world, to hear it. Walter's granddaughter Chloe, 16 at the time of the delivery and closer to 18 by the time the full story had unfolded, watched her grandfather's unlikely involvement in Vivian Ashcroft's recovery with a particular kind of quiet astonishment that Walter found, in his own words, more meaningful than almost anything else that came out of the entire experience. Chloe had spent the 4 years since her mother's death in a careful, guarded silence of her own, not the medical kind that had held Vivian captive, but the ordinary, human kind that grief sometimes imposes on people too young to have a language for what they've lost. She asked her grandfather, not long after Vivian's story became local news, whether he thought grief always found its way out eventually, one way or another, the way it had for Vivian after 12 long years. Walter told her he didn't know, honestly, whether every grief eventually found a way out, but that he believed, more firmly than he believed almost anything else in his 60-some years on Earth, that it helped enormously to have people around who were willing to say true things out loud, even small ones, even ones that seemed to have nothing to do with anyone else's pain, because you never knew, walking into any room on any ordinary Tuesday, exactly what door a small true thing might happen to open. Chloe, in the 2 years that followed, gradually became more willing to talk about her own mother, about the particular things she missed, and the complicated tangle of love and anger and grief that addiction leaves behind in the people who survive it, conversations she and Walter had slowly, over many ordinary evenings at their kitchen table, conversations Walter has come to believe, in his own quiet way, were made possible in part by watching what happened when a woman he had never met before, finally, after 12 years, found a way to say a single word out loud. Vivian Ashcroft, now in her mid-70s, remains actively involved in Ashcroft Textiles, though she has gradually shifted more day-to-day responsibility to a leadership team she personally selected and trusts, a team built, unlike Preston's tenure, around transparency rather than accumulated, unchecked authority. She keeps the antique record player in the same sitting room where Walter Higgins once stood with a replacement needle in his hand, and she plays Sunday Kind of Love every Sunday morning, the same ritual her husband Thomas once kept for 31 years, a ritual she is, for the first time in over 3 decades, finally able to keep aloud, singing along in a voice that still carries, in its lower registers, the faint rough edges of 12 years of silence. Walter Higgins still drives delivery routes, though less frequently now, having cut back his hours once Vivian's foundation, at Chloe's quiet encouragement, offered him a modest stipend for his advisory board role that allowed him some additional breathing room in a household budget that had been stretched thin for years. He does not think of himself as anyone particularly special, and he tends to deflect with the same easy humility that has defined him throughout this entire story. Any suggestion that he did anything more remarkable than say something true out loud on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. But Vivian Ashcroft, when she tells the story herself, at foundation events, and occasionally to journalists who still find their way to her 12 years later, insists on a different framing, one she repeats often enough that it has become, in its own way, the closing line of nearly every account of her recovery. She tells them that 17 specialists across 3 countries, armed with every tool modern medicine could offer, failed for 12 years to give her back her voice, and that a delivery driver covering someone else's route, with nothing but his own honest grief and no idea he was doing anything remarkable at all, gave it back to her in the space of a single unguarded sentence. She tells them that this, more than any lesson about medicine or business or even grief, is the truest thing she learned in 12 years of silence. That the people the world overlooks most easily, the delivery drivers, the warehouse workers, the ordinary single fathers raising grandchildren on modest wages, are so often carrying, without ever knowing it, exactly the kind of quiet, unguarded truth that the rest of us, however wealthy, however accomplished, however surrounded by experts, most desperately need to hear. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the smallest, most ordinary moments can carry more weight than anyone expects, we would love to hear which part stayed with you the longest. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that healing sometimes comes from the most unexpected places, and we will see you in the next story. No account of this story is complete without acknowledging the quiet, steady presence of Dolores Ferris, who worked in the Ashcroft household for over 20 years and who, more than anyone else, bore witness to the full arc of Vivian's silence and Vivian's return. Dolores had watched, year after year, as Preston's visits grew more frequent and his documents grew thicker, and she had raised her concerns, gently and repeatedly, to the 2 board members she trusted most, concerns that were heard sympathetically but never acted upon, absent the clear, decisive voice that only Vivian herself could have provided. It was Dolores who first understood, standing in the doorway of that sitting room, exactly what she was witnessing when Vivian gasped Thomas's name for the first time in 12 years. And it was Dolores who had the presence of mind, in the overwhelming minutes that followed, to gently ask Walter Higgins to stay a while longer, to keep talking, to keep filling the room with the same easy, unguarded conversation that had somehow, impossibly, reached her employer after 12 years of expert silence. Vivian has said, in the years since, that she owes Dolores a debt she can never fully repay, not simply for her decades of loyal service, but for the specific, quiet courage of a woman who kept advocating for her employer's interests during years when that employer could offer nothing in return but a grateful, silent nod. Dolores remains with the Ashcroft household today, in a role she describes, with characteristic modesty, as largely unchanged from what it has always been, though anyone who has watched her and Vivian together in the years since Vivian's recovery would tell you that the relationship between them now carries a depth of mutual trust that 12 years of silence, however difficult, ultimately helped to forge. Sunday kind of love plays now, every week, through the same antique record player Walter Higgins once helped repair, filling a sitting room that spent 12 years in near total silence with a particular warm crackle of vinyl and a voice, once lost and now found, singing quietly along. Vivian keeps a small, framed photograph on the side table near her chair, not of Thomas, though his photograph sits elsewhere in the house, but of Walter Higgins and his granddaughter Chloe, taken at the Foundation's first advisory board meeting. A photograph, she says, reminds her of the exact lesson she is most determined never to forget. It is, in the end, a simple lesson, though it took 12 years of silence and 17 specialists and 1 accidental sentence from a stranger to teach it to her fully, that the human voice, when it finally returns, when it is finally heard, is never really about the words themselves. It is about the courage to say something true and the willingness of someone else, however unlikely, however overlooked, to be standing close enough and open enough to hear it. It is worth pausing on the specific weight of those 17 specialists because the number, repeated so often in later accounts of Vivian's story that it became something close to a refrain, represents 12 years of a family's genuine, exhausting effort to find an answer through every conventional channel available to people of extraordinary means. The first 3 specialists, consulted within the initial year after the accident, were neurologists at major academic medical centers, each of whom ran an increasingly sophisticated battery of imaging studies, all of which confirmed the same frustrating conclusion: no structural damage to the brain regions classically associated with speech production, no damage to the vocal cords or the muscles required for speech. Nothing that modern neuroimaging could point to as a clear, fixable cause. The 4th and 5th specialists, speech-language pathologists with subspecialty training in post-traumatic communication disorders, worked with Vivian for the better part of 2 years, developing increasingly creative therapeutic approaches, all of which produced incremental gains in her ability to communicate through writing and gesture, but none of which unlocked actual speech. By the 4th year, Vivian's family, still primarily meaning Vivian herself directing her own care through written instructions, had begun consulting specialists further afield. A renowned neuropsychiatrist in London who specialized in trauma-related conversion disorders. A Swiss clinic known for experimental treatment protocols involving a combination of intensive psychotherapy and emerging neurostimulation technology. A Boston-based research team studying the exact intersection of grief and traumatic brain injury that would, years later, turn out to be the closest anyone had come to correctly theorizing what had actually happened to her. Each consultation produced careful, thoughtful, expensive analysis. None produced her voice. By the 10th year, Vivian had largely stopped pursuing new specialists, not out of any loss of hope exactly, but out of kind of weary pragmatism that Dolores Ferris recognized well. The particular exhaustion of a person who has tried, sincerely and repeatedly, to fix an unfixable thing, and who has begun, slowly, to build a life around the thing instead. It was into this exhausted 12-year plateau that Walter Higgins walked, entirely by accident, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, carrying a box of record player parts, and no idea whatsoever that he was about to succeed where 17 credentialed specialists across 3 countries had not. To understand why Walter's particular sentence, on that particular afternoon, carried the weight it did, it helps to understand what those 4 years since his wife Margaret's death had actually looked like for him. Years he rarely discussed in detail, even with people close to him, but which shaped, in ways Walter himself only partially recognized, the easy, unguarded honesty he brought into every room he entered. Margaret Higgins had died of ovarian cancer, diagnosed late and treated aggressively for 11 difficult months before her death, a loss that had come only a year before Walter's daughter's fatal overdose. 2 devastating losses close enough together that Walter has said, in the rare interviews he agreed to after Vivian's story became public, that he sometimes struggles to remember which year certain memories actually belong to, the grief of that period having blurred together into something closer to a single, continuous wound than 2 distinct losses. Margaret had been, by Walter's account, the talker in their marriage, the one who filled silences easily, who struck up conversations with strangers in grocery store lines, who Walter had loved partly, he has admitted, because her easy warmth gave him permission to remain the quieter, steadier presence beside her. Her death had left him, in the early months, uncertain how to fill the silences she had always filled for him, and it was, strangely, in the process of learning to do that for himself, and later for his grieving granddaughter Chloe, that Walter had developed the particular habit of easy, unguarded conversation with strangers that had once been entirely his late wife's gift, and had slowly, through necessity and grief, become his own. The song Sunday Kind of Love had not actually been a song Margaret played every single Sunday, as Walter's offhand comment to Vivian implied. It had been, more specifically, the song playing on the kitchen radio the last ordinary Sunday morning before her diagnosis, a morning neither of them had known, at the time, was the last fully healthy Sunday they would ever share, a detail that had lodged itself so deeply in Walter's memory that the song had become, without his ever fully articulating it even to himself, inseparable from a particular, specific quality of loss. The ache of an ordinary moment that only reveals its full weight in hindsight, once everything that followed it has already happened. It was this precise quality of grief, ordinary and retrospective and deeply, quietly human, that matched, with an exactness no specialist could have engineered, the exact shape of Vivian's own unspoken mourning for Thomas, a man whose death she had never fully allowed herself to grieve aloud, tangled as it had become with the accident that took her voice entirely. Two ordinary people, each carrying an almost identical shape of loss without ever knowing it, happened to occupy the same room for 4 unremarkable minutes on a Tuesday afternoon. And something, finally, after 12 years, gave way. The emergency board meeting Vivian called 6 weeks after her speech returned deserves a fuller account, because the specific exchange between Vivian and Preston, more than any summary can fully capture, illustrates exactly the transformation her recovered voice represented, not merely as a medical fact, but as a restoration of authority that Preston had spent 6 years growing comfortable operating without. Vivian entered the boardroom, according to 3 board members present that day, wearing a suit she had not worn in over a decade, a deliberate choice, she later admitted, meant to signal to everyone in the room that the woman walking in was not a fragile invalid returning gratefully to the margins of her own company, but the same exacting, formidable executive who had built Ashcroft Textiles from a single struggling mill 4 decades earlier. She did not raise her voice throughout the entire presentation that followed, a restraint that made the content of what she said land with considerably more force than shouting ever could have. She walked the board through 6 years of subsidiary entity formations, cross-referencing each one against the exact dates of board meetings where Preston had presented them as routine restructuring dates. Vivian noted, without editorializing, had clustered suspiciously around periods when her own written communication capacity was at its most limited following various setbacks in her recovery. Periods Preston could not have known about in advance unless he had been paying considerably closer attention to her medical status than a devoted nephew's ordinary concern would explain. Preston attempted, twice, to interject with explanations, and both times Vivian, without raising her voice, asked him to hold his response until she had finished, a request delivered with such calm, immovable authority that both times he fell silent immediately, a reaction that one board member later described as the moment the entire room understood, beyond any doubt, exactly who was actually in control of that meeting. When Vivian finally finished and invited Preston to respond, his explanation, built around characterizing the transfers as standard tax-efficient restructuring, collapsed within minutes under a single question Vivian asked directly. If the restructuring had genuinely been intended to benefit the company, why had every single subsidiary entity listed Preston himself, rather than Ashcroft Textiles, as majority owner? Preston did not have an answer. The vote to remove him from his position followed within the same meeting, unanimous, and delivered by board members who had, several admitted afterward, harbored doubts about Preston for years without ever having the standing, absent Vivian's own clear voice, to act decisively on them. The Ashcroft Foundation for Neurological Recovery, established within 8 months of Vivian's return to speech, focused its initial research funding on exactly the kind of case that had defined Vivian's own 12 years of silence: functional and psychogenic speech disorders following traumatic brain injury, a field the Foundation's founding medical advisors confirmed remained chronically underfunded relative to the number of patients it affected, largely because such cases fell into an uncomfortable gap between neurology and psychiatry that neither field had historically claimed full ownership of. Vivian personally interviewed each of the researchers the Foundation ultimately funded in its first year, bringing to those interviews a depth of lived understanding that impressed even veteran clinicians accustomed to funding decisions made by boards with no direct experience of the conditions they were studying. She asked questions no purely clinical background could have generated, questions about the specific, disorienting loneliness of being fully cognitively present while unable to participate in the most basic rhythms of human conversation. Questions about the particular cruelty of a medical system that measured recovery almost entirely through physical and cognitive testing, while having almost no reliable framework for measuring or addressing the emotional and relational cost of losing one's voice for years at a stretch. Walter Higgins, seated on the Foundation's advisory board specifically because Vivian insisted a non-clinical, lived perspective belonged in every major funding decision, found himself, in that first year, offering input that several of the credentialed researchers on the board later admitted had reshaped their thinking in ways their own training had not fully prepared them for. He argued, more than once, for research funding directed not merely at unlocking speech through clinical intervention, but at supporting the family members and caregivers who spent years, as Dolores Ferris had, advocating for patients who could not advocate fully for themselves. A perspective the Foundation ultimately built into a dedicated caregiver support initiative that Vivian has since called one of the organization's most meaningful early decisions. Ashcroft Textiles, under Vivian's restored leadership, underwent changes in the years that followed that went well beyond simply undoing the financial damage of Preston's tenure. Vivian, drawing on 12 years of enforced observation, years spent watching her own company from a position of near-total powerlessness, implemented a set of governance reforms that several business journalists covering the story described as unusually thoughtful for a company of its size, reforms built explicitly around preventing any future concentration of unchecked authority, regardless of family relationship or board tenure. She restructured the company's board to require mandatory rotating independent oversight of any transaction involving related party entities, a direct response to exactly the kind of structure Preston had exploited for 6 years. She established a formal board-level communication protocol requiring any major financial decision to be independently verified and explained to her, or to any future CEO who might one day find themselves in a diminished communication capacity for any reason, medical or otherwise, a policy, she has said, with a rare flash of dry humor, she hopes the company never actually needs to use again, but that she considers a permanent monument to exactly what 12 years of silence taught her about how easily authority can be quietly stolen from someone unable to fully defend it in real time. The company's employees, many of whom had worked under Preston's increasingly erratic leadership for years without understanding the full financial picture Vivian eventually uncovered, greeted her return with what several long-tenured staff described as something close to relief, a sense that the company's original founding values, the same relentless work ethic and instinct for doing things properly that had built Ashcroft Textiles from a single mill decades earlier, had returned to the building alongside Vivian's restored voice. Vivian Ashcroft, when asked in later years what she would say to Walter Higgins if she had one final chance to fully express her gratitude, tends to demur, insisting that nothing she could say would adequately capture what those 4 minutes in her sitting room actually meant. 12 years of silence broken not by any grand gesture or expert intervention, but by the plain, unguarded honesty of a stranger telling the truth about his own grief on an entirely ordinary Tuesday afternoon. But she has said more than once that if she had to choose a single lesson to leave behind from her own extraordinary story, it would be this: that the people who move through the world with the least apparent power, the delivery drivers, the caregivers, the single parents raising grandchildren on modest wages, so often carry within them exactly the kind of plain, unguarded truth that the rest of the world, wrapped in its own noise and its own carefully managed silences, most desperately needs to hear. She keeps, alongside the framed photograph of Walter and Chloe, a small handwritten note in her own careful script, the very first full sentence she wrote once her hand had steadied enough to hold a pen reliably again in the weeks after her voice returned. It reads simply, "Some doors only open when someone finally tells the truth loud enough for the person on the other side to hear it." She has never fully explained, even to Dolores, exactly who she meant by that sentence, though anyone who has heard the full story of Walter Higgins and his accidental, unguarded kindness on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon can likely guess. 2 years after that ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Chloe Higgins graduated high school, and Vivian Ashcroft, invited by Walter almost as an afterthought, insisted on attending in person, arriving in a car far more modest than her wealth would have suggested, sitting in the bleachers among the other families, applauding along with everyone else when Chloe's name was called. It was, by Walter's own account, one of the more surreal afternoons of his life. Watching a woman whose company employed thousands of people sit quietly beside him on a hard aluminum bleacher, cheering for his granddaughter with the same unguarded warmth she might once have reserved for family of her own. Vivian gave Chloe, as a graduation gift, not money, which she suspected Walter's quiet pride would have made him hesitant to accept on his granddaughter's behalf, but a scholarship fund she had quietly established through her foundation specifically for students who had lost a parent to addiction, a fund named, at Vivian's insistence, not after Chloe or after Walter, but simply the Sunday Fund, a name only a small handful of people fully understood the meaning of. Chloe, who had spent 4 years since her mother's death learning to speak more openly about her grief, partly through her grandfather's example and partly, she has said, through witnessing what Vivian Ashcroft's own broken silence eventually taught her about the cost of carrying pain alone, used part of her graduation speech, unprompted and unrehearsed with her grandfather beforehand, to speak about exactly that lesson, about the particular grace of people willing to say true, difficult things out loud, even when it would be easier, so much easier, to simply stay quiet. Walter, sitting in the audience, has said it was the first time in years he had cried in public without any embarrassment at all, understanding, watching his granddaughter speak with a clarity and courage he had once feared her own grief might never fully allow her, that whatever unexpected thread had connected his ordinary Tuesday afternoon delivery to Vivian Ashcroft's extraordinary recovery had somehow, in its own quiet way, found its way back around to bless the person he had been trying hardest all along to protect. It is easy, telling this story from its ending, to make that Tuesday afternoon feel inevitable, as though the universe had always intended for Walter Higgins to cover Deshawn's route that particular day, for Vivian Ashcroft to be sitting in that particular chair, for a decade-old memory of a Sunday morning song to align so precisely with a widow's unspoken grief for her own husband. Walter himself resists that framing whenever it comes up, insisting, with characteristic modesty, that nothing about that afternoon felt remarkable while it was happening, that he set down a box, made idle conversation the way he always did, and left 20 minutes later with no idea that anything unusual had occurred at all, driving on to the next stop on his route with a delivery schedule still to finish before dark. It was in the truest sense an entirely ordinary afternoon, indistinguishable in every visible way from the thousands of other ordinary afternoons that came before and after it in Walter Higgins's 6 years behind the wheel of a delivery van. And perhaps, Vivian has said, turning the idea over more than once in the years since, that is exactly the point worth remembering. The reason this particular story continues to resonate with people who hear it, long after the specific details of her accident and her company and her recovery have faded from memory. Not that something extraordinary happened on an extraordinary day, but that something extraordinary happened on the most ordinary day imaginable, delivered by the most ordinary, overlooked kind of person, proving, in a way no specialist or research study ever fully could, that the difference between an ordinary Tuesday and the day that changes everything is sometimes nothing more than a single true sentence, spoken by someone who has no idea, in the moment, just how much it might matter. If this story reminded you that healing rarely arrives on schedule, and that the people we least expect are so often the ones who help us find our way back, share it with someone who needs that reminder today, and we will see you in the next story. 12 years of silence. One accidental sentence. A voice and a company and a family finally restored, not through any grand design, but through the plain, overlooked kindness of a man who had no idea, walking up that gravel drive on an ordinary Tuesday, that he was about to change a stranger's life forever. That is the story of Vivian Ashcroft and Walter Higgins, of a 12-year silence and the single ordinary sentence that finally broke it, of a company nearly lost and a family quietly rebuilt, and of the particular, enduring truth that sits at the center of every version of this story anyone has ever told. That kindness offered without expectation, honesty spoken without agenda, has a way of finding exactly the person who needs it most on exactly the day they need it, even when neither person involved has any idea what is about to happen at all.